Hi, fourth graders. This is Mrs. Kalen. This is going to be probably our last pre-recorded Zoom or lesson for this year. Next week will be our last week meeting for the year with you as fourth graders, and we'll do it by Zoom. And I'm going to send out some instructions for some fun things. We're gonna keep it really light. I'm going to be talking about lots of cool books that you can read during the summer, and I'm going to get some recommendations from you that you can share, and we're going to make a list together of my recommendations and your recommendations. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Today, what we're going to do when we get started with our lesson in a couple minutes, we're going to try to zoom through and finish the 21 balloons. I've really been enjoying reading this book with you. I know we've kind of had to read it in a bit of a chopped up way, not straight through because we haven't been together, but I hope that you've been enjoying it. So, couple of announcements before I start reading. The first thing is that we are getting ready to have you return books to school. Mrs. Haynes is going to be sending out a schedule to your parents in a couple days of a time when parents are going to be coming in to pick up stuff that you've left at school, drop off anything that you have at home that needs to go back, so we can be all squared away and hopefully be together next school year, and have everything ready for you guys to come back. So hopefully that will all work out great. And what I'm going to do in the meantime is I've started to post a list of overdue books, which are really just all the books that are checked out. Some of you, I know it's been a while since you've probably even looked at your library books because you might have finished them a couple months ago. But take a look, so you know what you have. You can even look with your families and make sure that you and your siblings know where all your books are, so that when it's your family's turn to come bring things back to school, you can return everything so Mrs. Neville and I can then come in and check all the books in and get them ready for next year. That's it. I'm sending out summer reading lists, like I said, with the recommendations for to read anytime. You could start reading summer reading tomorrow if you want. But I'm going to collect some recommendations from you guys too, and we'll talk about that next week. Okay, so here we go, the 21 balloons. So what was happening last time? We actually stopped mid-chapter last time in a chapter called Concerning the Giant Balloon Raft. And we stopped there. The chapter was long. I'm hoping we can get through the whole thing today. I'm pretty sure we can. There's a lot of illustrations in this last section, so I'll show them to you as well. The giant balloon raft was being described as the way that they could get off the island if they needed to, right? Remember, they're living on basically a giant active volcano. So is the chance that they might have to evacuate pretty high? I'd say so. And we know from the beginning of the book, right, that something dreadful did in fact happen. Okay, so here we go. Resuming Professor Sherman's questions about how they could get off the island if they needed to. Isn't it possible to land the balloon platform? Hardly so, said Mr. F. In the first place, it would be hard to find enough level space in which to land such a huge aircraft. So remember, it was what their evacuation plan was, this giant platform that everybody could stand on that would be lifted by 20 balloons. It would be hard to find enough level space on which to land the huge aircraft. And in the second place, it wouldn't be possible to deflate the balloons fast enough to prevent the wind from blowing it and dragging it across the countryside. We would have to deflate them slowly in order to make a reasonably slow landing. And before we would be able to collapse them, the wind would drag us off, ripping the platform to splinters and endangering our lives. We wouldn't dare risk a landing like this. The plan we plan to jump off, picking our countries and spots with care. If we ever have to take a trip on it, Professor Sherman, I would advise you to get a parachute as soon as you possibly can. How can I get one on Krakatoa? I asked. See, Mrs. M. She and her husband designed and made all of the family parachutes. I'm sure she has enough silk left over to make you an ordinary one. We went together to the M's Moroccan house, and I told Mrs. M my problem. Why, certainly, she said, I can make you a parachute, but it will take me about 2 weeks, and then I doubt if you'll be needing it before then. I hope not, anyway, she said, laughing. Of course, and I said, take your time. There's no rush at all. What do you think? Might there be a rush? There might be a rush. Do they know when in an emergency, you never know when it's going to strike? Okay, next chapter. This is What Goes Up Must Come Down. And here we have Professor Sherman very excitedly telling his story. This is chapter 10. I spent the morning of August 26, 1883, or D-Day, in the month of Lamb of Krakatoa, as I had spent the morning before, swimming and sunbathing on that delightful little fine coral beach. After having a light eating at the C's Chinese restaurant, I attacked a Dutch breakfast at Mr. D's with gusto, a breakfast that included many cups of the richest, most delicious hot chocolate I had ever had the pleasure of drinking. I was afraid to go swimming after such a huge meal, so I took a sunbath with my good friend Mr. F for an hour or so when we reached the beach. I was pleased to see that I was getting quite tan. I got my first real burn when I made my bizarre nude arrival on Krakatoa and added to it the day we flew on the balloon merry-go-round, and considerably darkened it the morning at the beach on the morning before on the beach. I was so fast losing my comparatively pale appearance which so distinguished me at first from my fellow Krakatoans. Up to now, Mr. F said, as the movement of the Earth's surface rolled over near me, you have asked me many questions, which I have done my best to answer. I think you know now just about all there is to know about life on the island. Now I am going to ask you to tell me all you can think of in the way of news about my native city of San Francisco, a city from which you have just arrived and which I haven't seen in over 7 years. That's fair enough, I said. Then I started to think of how best to do this. As a school teacher, I was pretty well tied down to a rather monotonous form of urban life. But I did I did get to know a lot of people. I conducted classes for children between the age of 10 and 15, which was the age of the children of the Krakatoan families. I reasoned, therefore, that the parents of the children I taught must have been about the same age as Mr. F described. As Mr. F. I described San Francisco to him as a social columnist would, telling him about these people as though they were my closest friends, telling him what they were doing in terms of parties, minstrels, circuses, theaters, dinners, whatever social functions I could remember having attended with any of them. This proved an excellent idea, for he had known some of the people I mentioned and had heard others talked about by his friends on Krakatoa. I suppose one doesn't think of one's hometown in terms of streets and buildings as much as one does personal associations, friends, and relatives. That kind of makes me think of what's happening now. I don't think too much about places that I would like to visit after our social distancing days have ended. I think more about people that I want to see. Whenever I mentioned a friend of his eyes lit up and he started firing all sorts of questions at me. He was amazed at the many details, stories, and anecdotes I could tell about the children. You must be very fond of the children. You seem to take such humorous and sympathetic attitude towards the stories in their classrooms, of their classroom tricks and pranks. I still had no intention of telling anybody on the island that I had been a school teacher, but of course in telling Mr. F about his friends in San Francisco, I had clear memories of their children, to whom I was subjected to every day, whose homes I only visited on a rare occasion, and usually on trying or formal occasions. Yes, I gritted my teeth. I've always been close to children. I continued, mentioning more people Mr. F knew and recounting as many incidents as I could recall about them. I must say Mr. F was a good listener. We took a swim, let the sun dry us off, and then returned to Mr. F's house. While I was dressing, Mr. F ran around to all the houses, preparing everybody for the talk that I was going to give. So he's going to talk to everybody now about San Francisco. I was very pleased in this simple way. I was perhaps going to be able to repay them for their fabulous hospitality. We had a delicious lunch, which consisted of a huge portions of Javanschriestal, which is Javanese rice cooked and curried as the Dutch do it in the Dutch East Indies. Krakatoa is actually part of the Dutch East Indies, though no Dutchman has ever cared to set foot on the island. We had lots of this hot rice and huge glasses of wonderful cold Javanese tea. It was pretty hot from my freshly acquired sunburn. It was warm inside from this delicious curry, and after several stimulating glasses of tea, I had a nice warm feeling all over as I prepared to give my talk. Mr. F waited until all the tables had been cleared by the D family, and I placed a chair on one of the tables. He silenced the crowd, introduced me as a speaker in an informal and nice way. I climbed on the table, sat down, and after the 20 families were comfortably seated, I began my talk. The response was amazing and most gratifying. Each time I mentioned a new name, at least one face in the audience would light up. There would have been much nudging of elbows, smiles, and faraway homesick looks. Giving this simple talk, which seemed to bring so much genuine pleasure to these people, was a tremendous joy to me. However, when I looked out the window, I noticed that the ground seemed a little more active than usual. Being a new citizen of Krakatoa, I didn't know whether there was anything unusual about this at first, so I went on with my talk. As I recall it, before being most rudely interrupted by the singularly sinister event, I had talked for nearly 3 hours. I noticed the earth was moving with increased violence. I looked at my watch. The movement of the earth's surface usually subsided completely within a few minutes. But this afternoon, it had been increasingly violent over a period of 2 hours. This was quite alarming. I called this to the attention of the other people. They all turned and looked out the window. Some of them didn't seem at all alarmed, but others looked quite frightened. I was far from feeling at ease. Mr. M walked over to the window and looked out. After a few minutes, he said, "Don't think it's much to get alarmed over. After all, most of our houses were knocked down in 77. "But they were simple huts," said Mr. T. "Oh, I know, but they had diamond foundations too. This house hasn't shown any signs of the slightest vibration. Please go on with your talk, Professor Sherman." This seemed to reassure everyone considerably, though I can't say my heart was in my speech as much as it had been before. I noticed that my audience was rather restless too. And suddenly, and this was a sight which is as vivid to me now as it was when I first saw it, the wall opposite me slowly and almost noiselessly opened in a crack large enough to allow the sun to shine through. A considerable amount of powdered plaster dropped on the heads of the families in the room, and the windows cracked and the wall broke open. The windows had all been closed, so that usual noise of the mountain wouldn't interfere with my talk. Now, through the crack in the wall and the broken windows, the rumbling of the mountain thundered in full force. Mr. M rushed to the table where I was sitting, leaped onto it, and immediately started shouting instructions. "I want all the women and little children to run to the platform at once and start taking the covers off the balloons. I want all the men to run quickly to their houses and grab their family parachutes." Hearing the word parachute at that moment came to me like a blow to the head. And dashed to the balloon platform. "I want the 6 boys who are 15 or older to take whatever food Mrs. D has prepared for tonight and rush it to the platform." He clapped his hands loudly, and the room was emptied at once. He turned towards me and said, "We've rehearsed this 1,000 times. Don't be alarmed, Professor Sherman. I'm confident that everything will turn out all right. We'll be off in less than 15 minutes. Now," he said, "you're the only man with no particular job at this time. We all have pretty large amounts of diamonds sewn into a pouch attached to our family parachutes. Why don't you take a bucket and see if you can get to the mines and grab some diamonds? A few big ones will care for you quite nicely. But don't go too near the mines if it's too dangerous. Please, Professor Sherman, don't go near the mines if it's..." He was shouting at me, for I was off to the mines like a madman as soon as I could get the gist of his suggestion. Unfortunately for me, this was a waste of time. It was impossible to approach the mountain. I knew I had just a little over 10 minutes time, the time needed to fill the balloons. I tried running. The action of the Earth's surface threw me to the ground. I tried walking. I doddered, staggered, floundered, and tumbled. I tried crawling, but the Earth's rumblings kept heaving and rolling me over on my side. I looked at the mountain ahead and saw at once that it would be impossible to reach in any short time allotted to me. I threw away my bucket, turned, and ran to the village for the platform, reeling, bucking, falling back every few feet along the way. And here he is trying to get away. I'm trying to get back to the house and the balloon platform. I was there in time to see the crystal Krakatoan house splinter and flatten to the ground in a great shower of broken glass. The M's Moroccan house, full of those amazing inventions, was burning like a huge plum pudding, no doubt due to a short circuit in the electric living room. When I arrived at the balloon platform, it was straining and the hoses ready to leap. There were many hands extended my way. I reached up with my arms and they were grabbed just as the balloon platform tore itself away. I was lifted onto the platform. I remember 20 pops like champagne corks in rapid succession as the rubber ball and socket connections were broken and the 81 Krakatoans swiftly bounded into the air. The first moments on the platform were bedlam. Some of the women were screaming, some of the children were crying, the men were feverishly trying to connect the hoses to the hydrogen tank, and the boys who controlled the levers allowing the gas to enter the balloons were shouting at the men to hurry up so they could all level the platform. We were flying right at the mountain on an uncomfortable slant, and we were gaining altitude very fast. It required a certain amount of patience and a 150-pound push to snap the hose connections together. The men in their frantic hurry would grab each end of the hose and start pushing them together towards each other, and then slip and bang their heads. 3 minutes after takeoff, everyone was shouting except me. I was afraid to interfere in the supposedly well-rehearsed maneuver, for fear of receiving an excited, angry punch to the nose. The hoses were all finally connected in one of those desperate last-minute actions of confusion. Every boy added gas to his balloon at once. Mr. M dumped water to insulate the hydrogen tank with a chip of the foot lever. A giant platform rose just in time to clear the mountaintop. We flew directly over the crater. Here, instead of being sucked downward by the vacuum, as we had been in the balloon merry-go-round when the mountain was calm, we were greeted by a roaring, swift upward blast of hot air, which catapulted us far into the sky. When we were about half a mile up, we were comparatively still. There might have been a little wind, but it wasn't strong enough to blow us off this hot, sulfurous air shaft. We were trapped on top of it, like those celluloid balls on upward streams of water in shooting galleries. Ladies and gentlemen, we spent the night, a horribly long, sleepless, broiling night on top of this volcano. The heat of the air from the crater and the altitude to which we were lifted caused the hydrogen to dilate the balloons until they looked ready to burst. So this heat and gas is actually like adding heat and gas to the hot air balloons, right? You already have hot air that's making these balloons rise. Now more is coming up from the volcano. So they're going up and the balloons are just about ready to burst. One relieving aspect of that miserable night was the upward current of air kept the platform nice and level, though we swayed back and forth rather violently at times. The light from the blazing crater made everything bright red. Here they are. See, there they are in their balloon platform, and here's the heat and the gas from the volcano blasting them up. It was bad enough to be broiling without looking bright red, too. This was indeed an ironic state of affairs. It was the highest any of us had ever flown, and still we each had the feeling that we were closer to the bottom of the earth of anything that we experienced before. I suppose, too, that our food was kept warm. though no one was eating anything that night. We spent 17 hours over that volcano, from 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the 26th until 10 o'clock the following morning. At that time, the shaft of hot air seems to have lost its strength. We were lowered to an altitude of about 125 feet above the mountain, roughly 1,500 feet above sea level. The boys busied themselves on the platform again, and the men and women of Krakatoa gave longing looks at their island, believing that the eruptions had ceased and that they had been foolish to leave. I cannot say I shared this feeling at all. There wasn't a house left standing, and I had no desire to return to this now desolate and fearful place, even if the diamond mines were intact. We flew until we were a mile over Java. With a stunning suddenness, the island of Krakatoa, in several rapid, ear-splitting explosions, blew up straight into the air as far as we could see. Our flying platform rocked back and forth at 30-degree angles by the concussions. Those of us who were near the balustrade hung on for life. A few of those who were in the middle of the platform were tossed about like flapjacks in a skillet. We were 27 miles from the island when it happened, which was just about far enough away for safety. Any closer and we would have been dumped right off the platform into the Sunda Strait. We couldn't see what was left of Krakatoa because it was wrapped in a thick, huge, tremendously dark cloud of pumice, ash, lava, smoke, and dirt, and I suppose that a few $1 billion worth of diamonds were thrown in. We were fortunate the explosion was followed by a strong air current, produced by the same manner as waves on the surface of a lake when a stone is thrown in. We were swiftly being taken away from the scene of the eruption. We were afraid that ashes, rock, or even diamonds might fall on us and pierce our balloons, but all that actually happened of that nature was that we were soon enveloped in a thick black dust cloud, which was so dense that it was almost impossible to see through. Let's see here. We traveled through this cloud for hours, not being able to see where the ground or the sea beneath us was, and fearing the horrible fate of crashing into a mountaintop in Java. We tied handkerchiefs around our faces, and we couldn't breathe too much for the thick concentration of powdered ashes and pumice as we were traveling. And it seemed that as long as the wind was with us, this powdered remains of Krakatoa would follow along, forever enveloped in the ghost of a dead island. The wind generated by this explosion was tremendous. And for the duration of this extraordinary journey, we were hurtled through space at this fabulous speed. The food situation, now that I look back at it, was the funniest, I'm sure, in the history of life raft travel. We had 3 huge cauldrons of the Dutch dish Mrs. Z happened to have prepared for dinner that night of the eruption. The dish was called Stampot van Zirkel met Rookworst. We also had a huge jug of Van Houten's cocoa and a crate of Gouda cheeses. I have heard of shipwrecked men living for days on hardtack and water, but we citizens of the former island of Krakatoa lived on Stampot van Zirkel met Rookworst. This was a dish consisting of meat cooked in gravy, sauerkraut, and sausages. Mr. M, the man who first discovered the diamond mines in Krakatoa and who persuaded 20 other families to go and live there, felt responsible for all of them at this moment of crisis. He supervised the rationing of the food, allowing meager portions of the Stampot van Zirkel met Rookworst to each portion and 3 swallows of cocoa at each meal. He also advised every family except one to jump off at the first sight of land, no matter what this country might be. I have good reason for this, he said. Professor Sherman has no parachute. He will have to try to land the platform. It would be impossible and foolish for him to consider landing the platform on land. He will have to crash into a body of water. The family that volunteers to remain with him will help him control the balloons until water is sighted. Then they will jump off, leaving the platform for Professor Sherman. I want every family except one to jump off as soon as possible so that as much food can possibly be left over and available for Professor Sherman, whose journey over land might take him many, many days. With this in mind, the crate of cheeses, which are less perishable than the rest of the food, will be left intact for him. I paid a considerable amount of attention to this speech, and I seem to be the leading man and a most unhappy actor in a forthcoming melodrama. Mr. M then asked if there was any family that wanted to volunteer to stay with me, landing in the water. Mr. X volunteered, the X volunteered immediately, which cheered me up a great deal. On the afternoon of the second day, a black cloud had thinned out sufficiently, and we could now see that we were no longer flying over Java. I once tried to reconstruct this voyage on the balloon platform, and I believe that we were flying that time over the Indian Ocean. On the afternoon of the third day, we sighted land, and 19 of the families gave forth with rousing cheers, embraced each other, and broke into happy dances. The Fs ran to my side to comfort me. They showed me that they had no intentions of leaving me until they had seen me safely over another body of water. We were soon no longer over water, but flying over thickly vegetated jungles. Mr. M, leaning over intently over the balustrade, studied the nature of this country. He pointed out teakwood trees, sandalwood trees, and observed the redness of the earth. This is India, he said. 19 families had happily started readying their family parachutes. They were well designed. I shall describe them as best I can. There was square silk stretched out by 2 stout bamboo poles crossed diagonally from corner to corner. At each corner of the sheet, there hung 2 straps on a belt harness. Each family member put one of these belt harnesses on, and when they jumped, father, mother, and 2 children all descended together, with the bamboo poles keeping them far enough apart so that there was no danger of bumping into them mid-air. What an amazing contraption. See, look at this. This is not just one parachute. This is a family parachute. So they have 4 parachutes at the top, a sheet and poles connecting them. And here they are, each one. Because when you jump with a parachute, sometimes the wind can carry you. You know, if you were jumping with your family, everybody might fly out in different directions. They'd have to, you know, it would be hard to find each other. The families were anxiously looking out for a nice spot to land. At first, they flew over nothing but dense jungle life, and then we found a few small villages. Mr. M advised everyone to keep coming down advised everybody to avoid coming down over a village because the natives might not know what to make of these parachutes. They waited until they saw a proper spot in the distance, which seemed like a rather soft-looking plateau, and said goodbye to Mr. F and me, and earnestly wishing them the best of luck. They all jumped off together, and soon after they landed. The balloon platform lunged into the air, relieved of this weight. Mr. F, Mrs. F, F1 and F2 and I continued over a dreadful 9 more days, which took us across India, Persia, Turkey, Hungary, Austria, Germany, Belgium, and where the F family finally left me. And I took me alone over England until I was at last able to crash the platform into the Atlantic. It's getting long, but we have a few more pages, and I'm going to continue. If anybody wants to pause this and watch it in a few pieces, that's fine. I know that we are going over today, but I want to finish the book, and I think you do too. Okay, let's keep reading. We missed the Caspian Sea, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean. The 5 of us had spent 9 miserable days living mostly on cheese, rummaging through our barrels barrels of food like dogs in garbage cans, separating the spoiled food from the good, drinking rationed amounts of sauerkraut juice and stale cocoa, sleeping uncomfortably in 4-hour shifts, and running from balloon to balloon to keep the platform level until we thought we would drop dead from exhaustion. On the 9th day, we were over Belgium, and we sighted the English Channel. I said goodbye to our friends the Fs and helped them fix up their parachute, and sadly watched them as they dropped slowly over the earth below and started to attempt to land the platform. In order to get the valves which released the hydrogen from the balloons, I had to break these connections which attached to the tank. At 7 o'clock that night, flying over Scotland, I sighted the Atlantic Ocean and started a tug-of-war with each hose until I got all the connections apart and I started to descend. My trip ended in a 2-hour uphill run. Every time I let the gas out from one side of the platform, I would have to run to the other side, to the high side, and let the gas out of that. And then run back uphill to the other, from end to end, back and across, to and fro, in a perpetual incline. And here he is. See, it's slanting to one side as he lets them out, and then he has to run back up to let those out, and that sinks, and then he has to run back up. And finally crashed into the Atlantic. I kept being reminded of a vaudeville act I had once seen in the London Music Hall. A clown, dressed like a porter at a railroad station playing God Save the King, was running back and forth on the stage with hammers, striking the xylophones on the railroad, like railroad tracks. To the one tune of this giant xylophone, and he flopped on the stage exhausted, and the audience rocked with laughter. I assure you, you must have been awfully close to death when Captain Simon of the SS Cunningham, I must have been close to death when the captain of the SS Cunningham sighted me and picked me up 20 miles after my crash. The rest of my story, as you know, I believe you know. If you have any questions, I'd be gladly try to answer them. The audience rose as one and acclaimed Professor Sherman with a thunderous cheers and applause. Whew, we made it through his whole story. After 10 minutes of this hubbub, the mayor, who had been wildly shaking the professor's hand and patting him on the back, walked upstage and held his hands up to quiet the audience. Have you any questions? He asked. There was a silent pause. Then the man in the audience shouted, "How were you able to give such a wonderful talk in your sickened condition, Professor Sherman?" "Ha ha," the professor shouted, leaping from bed. "I feel fine. I've rested completely on the presidential train on my 5-day journey across the country. And I have made the talk standing up. I could have made the talk standing up, but when I saw this beautiful bed on the speaker's platform, I thought I'd be a stupid fool if I passed it up." The crowd laughed loudly at this, clapped its approval, and then the woman stood up. "What are you going to do now, Professor?" she asked. With a broad grin on his face, Professor William Waterman Sherman rolled up his coat sleeves. And what do you think they saw? His diamond cufflinks blazed and twinkled as they reflected the many rays from the footlights. "I have here a pair of diamond cuffs made simply of 4 diamonds the size of lima beans. They were given to me by my good friend Mr. F. the first day I landed in Krakatoa. I am going to sell these cufflinks and buy myself a balloon, which I will christen Globe the Second. I shall attach this balloon to a basket house and a seagull catcher on which I am now fully working. Using food for the ballast, I plan to spend 1 full year in the balloon. 1 year of truly delightful living in a balloon." And that is the end of the story. What would you do after that adventure? Would you ever get back in a balloon again? Why does he get back in a balloon? I'm fascinated by this. We are going to talk a little bit about the end of this book next week when we have our book talk discussion, but I'll open it up with a little bit of a discussion about 21 Balloons. I hope you really enjoyed this. I think this is such a fun book. It's a classic, such a classic creative adventure story. I think it's fun. I think it's funny. I really am glad that I got to read it with you. And I'm going to say farewell for now, and I will see you next week.